The summer sun hung heavy over the southern skies, baking the earth in a relentless heat. From a distance, the grand white columns of Whitmore Plantation gleamed like polished ivory, a symbol of wealth and power. Travelers passing through the dusty road often slowed their horses just to stare at its sheer size. The sprawling cotton fields that seemed endless, the perfectly trimmed hedges leading up to the mansion, and the sheer arrogance with which it rose above the land. To the outside world, it was a place of prosperity. To those who lived under its roof, however, it was a prison wrapped in lace. The man who ruled over this empire was Charles Whitmore, a plantation owner whose reputation traveled far beyond the county lines. He was respected, feared, and whispered about in the corners of taverns. His fortune had been built on sweat and blood, the labor of slaves who worked from dawn till dusk while overseers' whips cracked through the air. Charles prided himself on control, on order, on the illusion of perfection. He often entertained guests from other plantations, showing off his wealth with extravagant dinners, while ensuring that no one ever glimpsed the darker truths festering beneath his polished image. Yet behind the walls of the great house, shadows lingered. Servants moved in silence, afraid of speaking too loudly. The air was thick with secrets, with the kind of stories people dared not tell in the open. It was said that the Whitmore family carried a curse, not of blood or fortune, but of shame. That shame had a name. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, the only daughter of the powerful Charles. While other young women of the South were admired for their slender waists and porcelain beauty, Eleanor stood apart. She was large, heavy-set, and carried herself with the awkwardness of someone who had been reminded of her flaws since childhood. From the moment she stepped into society, she had been ridiculed. Behind her back, whispers followed her like shadows. The fat Whitmore girl, the unwanted daughter. Even her own father, the man who was supposed to shield her from cruelty, had grown ashamed of her. But that is not where this story begins. It begins with the day the plantation's perfect facade began to crack, when Charles Whitmore made a decision so unthinkable, so cruel, that even his most loyal servants gasped in disbelief. The fields themselves seemed to sense the unrest. Slaves worked silently, their bodies moving with routine precision. But their eyes darted toward the big house more often than usual. Overseers shouted to keep them focused, yet whispers passed from row to row like sparks jumping from dry wood. Everyone could feel it. A storm was coming. Inside the mansion, Charles sat in his study, staring out at his empire. His glass of whiskey trembled slightly as he tightened his grip. His daughter was a burden, a stain on the Whitmore name. Suitors had come and gone, each leaving with polite excuses but quiet laughter in their eyes. He could not marry her off. He could not parade her at balls without humiliation. In his twisted mind, there was only one solution left. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his overseer, a tall, gaunt man whose expression was as cold as iron. The overseer did not speak. He didn't have to. Both men knew the arrangement was already set in motion. Charles had made his choice. Eleanor would no longer be his problem. She would be handed over like cattle to one of the slaves. The overseer bowed his head slightly and left the room, leaving Charles alone with his drink and his bitterness. That night, while the plantation rested under a canopy of stars, whispers spread like wildfire. Slaves in the quarters exchanged worried glances. No one dared say the words aloud, but everyone knew. The master was about to commit a deed that would alter the course of their lives forever. The mansion, usually glowing with light, seemed darker than usual. Its great halls echoed with silence, the kind that precedes tragedy. Even the cicadas outside seemed muted, as if the land itself was holding its breath. And in her chamber, Eleanor sat by her mirror, tears streaking down her cheeks as she tried to imagine what future her father had planned for her. She knew nothing yet of the decision that had been made, only that she was once again being spoken of like an object, not a daughter. The Whitmore plantation was about to witness something that would shatter its pristine image. The daughter, the slave, and the master's pride would soon collide in a way no one could have imagined. And it all began with the secret her father carried in his heart that night. Eleanor Whitmore had never known what it felt like to be cherished. From the moment she was born, her father looked upon her not with tenderness, but with quiet disappointment. In his world, daughters were meant to be ornaments, delicate, beautiful, and easily displayed to enhance a man's pride. Eleanor, however, was none of those things. She was soft where society demanded sharpness, round where it demanded slenderness, and gentle where it demanded practiced charm. Her mother had died young, leaving Eleanor to be raised almost entirely under her father's stern eye and the disapproving whispers of housemaids. There was no womanly guidance, no maternal softness to shield her from the cruelty of others. As a child, she had often tried to win her father's affection. She would bring him flowers plucked from the garden, or drawings she scribbled with trembling hands. But Charles Whitmore rarely smiled. When he did, it was never at her. By the time she reached adolescence, the ridicule had become unbearable. At Sunday gatherings, when the Whitmores sat among other families of wealth, Eleanor noticed the stares. The young men never asked her to dance. The young women never invited her to whisper secrets or share ribbons. She would sit quietly in the corner, folding her hands in her lap, while her father's jaw tightened in embarrassment. The cruelest blow came when her father began arranging potential suitors. At first, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps love could still find her. Perhaps there was someone who would look past her body and see the heart beating within. But one by one the suitors visited, inspected her like livestock, and departed. Their excuses varied. Not a good match, differences in temperament, unsuitable for my estate. But the truth was always the same. No man wanted the plantation owner's obese daughter. Charles grew bitterer with each rejection. He stopped trying to hide his disappointment. At dinner, he would glare at her if she reached for another helping of food. He would speak of her in cold tones to guests, as if she were an obligation rather than flesh and blood. More than once, Eleanor overheard him mutter that she was a curse, a burden the family would never be rid of. For Eleanor, life became a cycle of humiliation and isolation. She took long walks at night through the plantation gardens, avoiding the stares of slaves and overseers alike. She felt their eyes on her, pitiful or mocking. It was hard to tell which. Sometimes she would stand before the great mirror in her room, clutching the folds of her dress, and whisper to herself, "Why was I born this way?" But no answer ever came. Despite her pain, Eleanor possessed a quiet resilience. Beneath the layers of sorrow lived a soul that longed for kindness. She read poetry in the solitude of her chambers, escaping into worlds where women were loved not for their bodies, but for their hearts. She dreamed of a man who would speak to her with gentleness, who would not recoil at her presence. She even dreamed of escape, though she knew she had no power to leave her father's iron grasp. The household staff treated her with a peculiar mix of pity and cruelty. Some whispered insults when they thought she could not hear. Others avoided her altogether, as if her presence brought shame upon them too. There was only one elderly maid who occasionally offered her comfort, slipping her sweets, brushing her hair, humming lullabies Eleanor barely remembered from childhood. But even that kindness was fleeting, for the maid was dismissed one winter for being too lenient with the girl. By the time Eleanor turned 20, her fate was sealed in her father's eyes. She was, to him, a wasted investment, a daughter who could neither be married off nor used to strengthen alliances. She was simply there, occupying space in the grand house, a living reminder of his failure. It was during this time, when her despair was at its deepest, that Charles made his most shocking decision. He would rid himself of her once and for all, not by locking her away, nor by sending her to distant relatives, but by an act so unthinkable it would ripple through the plantation like wildfire. The idea was cruel in its simplicity. Eleanor would be given away. Not to a suitor, not to a family friend, but to a slave. The whispers of this decision began to leak into the quarters before Eleanor herself had any inkling of it. Slaves spoke in hushed voices of what the master planned. Some thought it was a punishment for the slave who would receive her. Others thought it was a punishment for Eleanor herself. No one could fathom the humiliation of being treated as a burden to be passed off, as though her humanity counted for nothing. And still, Eleanor knew nothing of it. She sat in her chamber, clutching her poetry book, staring out the window at the endless cotton fields. She had grown accustomed to loneliness, to shame, to silence. She could not imagine that her life, so stagnant, so predictable in its misery, was about to shift violently into something far darker, far stranger than even her most haunted dreams. What she did not know was that her father's decision would not only alter her destiny, but also the destiny of one man among the enslaved. A man whose life had been defined by chains was about to be tied unwillingly to hers. And what would happen between them would change the balance of power in ways no one on the plantation could have ever predicted. Among the hundreds who toiled in the fields of Whitmore Plantation, there was one man who stood apart. His name was Josiah, though many simply called him Joe. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a quiet dignity that unsettled even the overseers. Unlike some of the younger slaves, Josiah had endured decades of servitude. His back bore scars from whips long past, but his eyes still carried the fire of a man who refused to be broken entirely. Josiah was known for his strength, both of body and of spirit. He could carry more than most men, work longer hours, and endure pain with silence. But he was also known for something far rarer, his sense of mercy. When other slaves quarreled, Josiah often stepped between them, his calm voice settling disputes before fists flew. In the quarters, children trusted him, and elders spoke of him as if he were a pillar keeping them all from collapsing. It was this reputation that both cursed and protected him. Overseers hated his quiet defiance, yet they hesitated to break him completely, for he was too valuable in the fields. And Charles Whitmore himself regarded Josiah with a mixture of resentment and fascination. He was, in many ways, the kind of man Charles wished he could claim as his own blood. Strong, commanding, unbent by humiliation. That envy would soon twist into cruelty. When word spread that Charles intended to gift his daughter to a slave, overseers speculated in hushed tones who it might be. Some thought it would be a young boy, someone easily controlled. Others guessed it would be one of the weakest, a man whose submission was guaranteed. But Charles had another idea. He wanted someone strong, someone who would not crumble under the humiliation, someone who could shoulder the burden he was casting away. That someone was Josiah. The decision struck like lightning in the quarters. At first, no one believed it. To give a slave the master's daughter, it sounded like madness, like a cruel joke. But when the overseer himself arrived and spoke Josiah's name, the truth became undeniable. The reactions were mixed. Some whispered that Josiah was cursed, chosen for something unnatural, something that would bring the master's wrath down upon him. Others muttered envy, for even in humiliation Josiah was being noticed, singled out. But Josiah himself felt only the heavy weight of dread. That night, as the others whispered around the fire, Josiah sat apart, staring into the darkness. He had seen cruelty in many forms, but this was something different. He was not being ordered to work harder or beaten for disobedience. He was being tied to the master's own blood. It was not a gift. It was a trap. He understood immediately what it meant. Humiliation, shame, and perhaps even death. To touch the daughter of the master, even under the master's command, was dangerous. It placed him in a position no slave should occupy. If Eleanor resisted, he would be blamed. If she submitted, he would still be despised. Either way, he would be marked forever as the slave who crossed an invisible line. The overseer's instructions were chilling in their simplicity. Josiah was told to prepare himself, to bathe, to wear clean clothes from the storeroom. It was all arranged. He would be brought to the mansion soon. There was no refusal. There was no escape. As he scrubbed the dirt from his hands that evening, Josiah's mind swirled. He thought of his mother, long gone, who used to whisper prayers over him at night. He thought of the men he had seen hanged for far lesser crimes. And he thought of Eleanor, the girl he had glimpsed only from afar, standing in the balcony of the big house, her round figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He had never spoken to her, never imagined he would. Now their lives would be forced together in a way neither of them had chosen. The slaves around him watched with wide, fearful eyes. Some shook their heads in pity. A few avoided him entirely, as if standing too close might bring trouble upon them as well. One elderly woman pressed a small charm into his palm, a crude carving meant to ward off evil. He closed his hand around it, not knowing if he believed in its power, but grateful for the gesture. By the time night fell, Josiah knew his fate was sealed. Whatever happened in the mansion, whatever twisted plan the master had devised, he would face it. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. He was property, and property did not refuse its owner. As the overseer's lantern bobbed through the darkness, coming closer to the quarters, Josiah rose to his feet. The firelight flickered across his face, casting deep shadows in his eyes. Around him silence fell. All knew this night would change him forever. Josiah took a slow breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward into the path of the overseer's light. His journey into the master's cruel scheme had begun. The night chosen for the exchange was one of oppressive silence. The plantation, usually filled with the sounds of crickets and distant laughter from the slave quarters, seemed unnervingly still. Clouds moved sluggishly across the moon, casting long shadows that crept across the cotton fields. It was as though the land itself understood that something unnatural was about to occur. Inside the Whitmore mansion, preparations were underway. Candles burned low in the great hall, their flickering flames bending in the draught. Servants moved quickly and quietly, avoiding Eleanor's eyes. They knew, though she did not yet fully understand, that the night would mark her in ways no one could undo. Charles Whitmore sat in his high-backed chair, his face stern, his whiskey glass clutched tightly in his hand. His eyes were hard like polished stone, and his jaw was set as if carved from iron. He had convinced himself that this was not cruelty but necessity. To him, Eleanor had become an unbearable embarrassment, and Josiah, the chosen slave, was simply a convenient vessel to rid him of the burden. In her room upstairs, Eleanor waited. She had been told little, only that her father demanded her presence later that night. She wore a pale dress, one that tightened uncomfortably around her waist and made her cheeks flush with shame. As she sat before the mirror, her hands trembled. She felt like a lamb being led somewhere she did not want to go, but she had long learned not to question her father's commands. Meanwhile, across the grounds, Josiah was being prepared. The overseer handed him a set of clothes, cleaner, sharper than the rags he usually wore, but still coarse against his skin. His hair was combed, his body scrubbed raw with soap until his skin stung. When he looked at his reflection in the rippling water barrel, he hardly recognized himself. Yet no amount of cleaning could erase what he was in the eyes of the master. Property, forced into a role he never chose. When the time came, Josiah was led across the darkened yard, his wrists unbound but his freedom non-existent. The glow of lanterns lit the path as overseers flanked him, their boots crunching against the gravel. Slaves from the quarters watched from the shadows, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others simply turned away, unwilling to witness what would come. At the grand staircase of the mansion, Josiah paused. The towering white columns seemed like prison bars, and the heavy oak door loomed before him like the mouth of a beast ready to swallow him whole. With a shove from the overseer, he stepped inside. The air in the hall was thick with tension. Eleanor stood near the fireplace, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously to her father. She did not understand why a slave had been brought before her, dressed and scrubbed as if for some grotesque ceremony. Her heart pounded in her chest as Charles rose from his chair and motioned for her to step closer. "Eleanor," he said, his voice firm and cold. "This is Josiah. He will take care of you now." The words hung in the air like a curse. Eleanor's lips parted, confusion flooding her face. She looked from her father to the slave and back again, as if searching for some explanation, but Charles offered none. His tone allowed no room for questions. Josiah bowed his head slightly, not out of respect, but because he knew to look the master in the eye would be dangerous. His heart beat heavily in his chest. He could feel Eleanor's gaze on him, filled with fear, confusion, and humiliation. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then Charles raised his glass as though sealing a bargain. "From this night on," he declared, "you are his. Do not shame me further." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The meaning of his words struck her like a blow. She was not being married, not being courted. She was being given away. Not to a man of wealth or station, but to one of the very slaves her father considered beneath him. It was not a gift of kindness. It was punishment. It was disposal. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at her father, silently begging for mercy. But Charles's face was unyielding. To him, she was no longer a daughter. She was a problem solved. Josiah's stomach turned as the weight of the moment pressed upon him. He had endured many humiliations, but this was different. This was not just about him. It was about her, about the cruel spectacle the master was creating for his own pride. He wanted to protest, to shout that he was no man's tool, but the overseer's presence reminded him of the cost. His voice, if raised in defiance, could be silenced forever. Eleanor's body shook with silent sobs. She could not believe what was happening, yet she could not fight it. She felt stripped of dignity, reduced to nothing but an object of her father's disdain, and standing before her, the slave her father had chosen was as much a victim as she. Charles lifted his hand, dismissing them both. "Take her," he ordered, his voice cutting through the silence. "She is yours now. Do with her what you will." The overseers stepped back, their faces carefully blank, though their eyes betrayed the discomfort of witnessing something so grotesque. The candles flickered, the shadows deepened, and the walls of the mansion seemed to close in. And in that moment, as Eleanor's tears fell and Josiah clenched his fists in quiet fury, the fates of two lives, bound not by choice but by cruelty, became entwined. The night of the trade had begun. The heavy door closed behind them with a thud that echoed through the dimly lit corridor. Eleanor flinched at the sound, her hands clutching her dress so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She could hear the overseer's footsteps fading away, leaving only the oppressive silence of the house. For the first time in her life, she felt completely abandoned, not just by her father, but by the world itself. Josiah walked a pace behind her, his broad frame casting a shadow that stretched across the hallway. His steps were slow, deliberate, yet burdened with a weight Eleanor could not see. He too felt the crushing finality of what had been decreed. Though his chains were gone, invisible shackles bound him still. They entered the room prepared for them, a smaller chamber near the back of the mansion, lit only by a single oil lamp. The bed loomed in the corner, its carved posts mocking the intimacy expected of it. Eleanor froze at the sight, her chest tightening as terror surged through her veins. She turned on him, her voice breaking into a whisper. "Don't," she choked, backing toward the wall. "Don't come near me." Josiah stopped in his tracks. He looked at her, not with hunger, not with cruelty, but with something she did not expect. Pity. His dark eyes held a depth she had never noticed before, a storm of pain and strength intertwined. Slowly, he raised his hands, palms open, as though surrendering. "I won't touch you," he said quietly, his voice deep but gentle. "Not unless you want me to." The words stunned her. For a moment, Eleanor wondered if she had misheard. Her father had thrust her into this man's hands like a discarded possession, expecting brutality, shame, and submission. Yet here he stood, offering something she had not felt in years: choice. Her eyes welled with fresh tears. "But my father," he said. Josiah cut her off with a shake of his head. "Your father may own my body," he said, the bitterness sharp in his tone. "But he doesn't own my soul. And he doesn't own yours either." Eleanor stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not a friend, not a suitor, not even her mother when she had been alive. All her life, she had been told who she was, what she would become, and how little value she carried. But in Josiah's words, there was defiance, not just for himself, but for her. The tension in the room shifted. Eleanor's fear, though not gone, softened into something else: confusion, curiosity, and a fragile spark of hope. She sank into the chair by the small table, burying her face in her hands. "Why would you spare me?" she whispered, her voice muffled. "You must hate me. I'm the daughter of the man who enslaves you." Josiah's jaw tightened. He crossed the room slowly, but instead of looming over her, he crouched down to meet her at eye level. His rough hands rested on his knees, clenched, holding back a lifetime of bitterness. "I don't hate you," he said, after a pause that seemed to carry years. "I hate the chains. I hate the whip. I hate the lies that tell men they're gods and others they're animals. But you're just as trapped as I am. Different chains maybe, but chains all the same." The words struck her like lightning. For the first time, Eleanor saw herself not as a victim of her father alone, but as part of a larger cruelty that consumed them both. She had always believed her suffering was unique. But now she understood. Josiah bore a weight far heavier than hers, and yet, somehow, he had the strength to show her mercy. The silence between them grew thick, filled not with dread, but with unspoken understanding. Eleanor lifted her head slowly, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the glow of the oil lamp. She met his gaze, and for the first time that night, she did not look away. Josiah's expression softened. He reached for the pitcher on the table, pouring water into a cup with steady hands. Then, without a word, he placed it in front of her. The gesture was simple, but to Eleanor it felt monumental. It was not the act of a master or a slave. It was the act of one human being offering kindness to another. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the cup. The touch was brief, but it sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but of something unnameable, something that unsettled and comforted her all at once. "Thank you," she whispered. Josiah gave a faint nod, his eyes lowering, as though afraid to hold hers too long. He rose to his feet, turning toward the window. The moonlight streamed in through the thin curtains, bathing his face in silver. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. "Just remember this night for what it is, not what he wanted it to be." Eleanor clutched the cup to her chest, her heart pounding. For so long, she had expected cruelty, had been conditioned to believe it was her only fate. Yet here, in this stolen moment of compassion, the world shifted. The slave her father had intended as punishment had become her protector. The tears fell again, but this time they carried not only sorrow, but release. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to hope. That maybe she was not worthless, that maybe she was not beyond saving, and that maybe, just maybe, fate had other plans. And Josiah, standing in the pale glow of the moon, felt a dangerous stirring in his chest. The quiet beginning of something forbidden, yet undeniable. The night of humiliation had turned into something no one had expected, a shocking kindness. Night did not keep secrets for long on the plantation. What happened in the big house always trickled down to the quarters, carried in fragments of overheard words, subtle glances, or the silence of those who knew too much. By the second day after Eleanor was given to Josiah, the air in the slave cabins hummed with a kind of nervous energy. It started as a murmur. A field hand swore he had seen Josiah walking beside the plantation owner's daughter without the usual whip at his back. A kitchen maid claimed Eleanor's eyes no longer looked hollow, that she even spoke softer to the servants when she passed them. Small changes, barely noticeable, but in a place where misery was routine. The smallest ripple was enough to stir the waters. "Something's happened," whispered Ruth, an older woman with hands cracked from decades of toil. She sat near the fire pit, her voice low but urgent as others leaned in to listen. "The master gave that poor girl to Josiah, but it ain't gone the way he planned." Her words carried weight. Ruth was one of the oldest on the plantation, and people trusted her instincts. The younger ones exchanged quick, wide-eyed glances. What could she mean? A man named Isaac spat into the dirt, his voice gruff with disbelief. "Don't be foolish, Ruth. You know what men do when they're given something they never asked for. The master wanted him broken and her shamed. Nothing more." But Ruth shook her head. I've seen Josiah's eyes since that night. They're different. Softer but sharper too. And that girl, she walks as if she's breathing for the first time. No man beaten down by the lash would dare look like that unless something unexpected has taken place. The fire crackled, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from the far side of the room, a quiet voice broke the silence. "I heard her crying," said Sarah, a young girl who worked in the kitchens. But not the kind of crying that comes from pain, more like someone who's been touched with kindness. A collective murmur rose. The very idea was unthinkable, a slave treating the master's daughter with gentleness instead of cruelty. It challenged the order that bound their world. Isaac frowned, his face shadowed. If that's true, it's dangerous. Too dangerous. The master won't stand for his daughter finding comfort in the arms of a slave. He'll see it as betrayal. Ruth's gaze hardened. Maybe it's the start of something bigger. Don't you see? Kindness where none is expected is the sharpest rebellion of all. If Josiah has found a way to give her dignity, then he's already defied the master more than any runaway ever could. The words sparked unease. Some nodded in quiet agreement, hope flickering where none had been before. Others shook their heads, afraid to believe in something that could only end in blood. Meanwhile, across the plantation, whispers spread among the overseers too. They had noticed the girl's absence from her usual sulking in the parlor, had seen Josiah's unusual silence in the fields. One even claimed he caught a glimpse of the two in the orchard at dusk, not standing apart, but side by side. By the third night, the story had twisted itself into a dozen shapes. Some said Josiah had bewitched Eleanor, using charms to win her sympathy. Others claimed she had fallen in love with him, desperate for the tenderness her father denied her. A few whispered even darker tales, that the master planned to use her humiliation as a warning to others, though why she seemed strangely unbroken baffled them. For Josiah, the whispers were a noose tightening around his neck. Every sideways glance in the quarters reminded him that his actions were being watched, measured, and judged. He had not asked for this burden, yet somehow he had inherited it. And Eleanor, fragile, fearful, but now blooming faintly with new confidence, seemed unaware of how dangerous their unspoken bond had become. One evening, Ruth pulled Josiah aside as he carried water buckets from the well. Her voice was low, her eyes sharp with worry. "Child, you've started something you may not be able to finish," she warned. "They're talking about you in every cabin, some with hope, some with fear. Hope is a dangerous thing here, Josiah. It can burn as quickly as it sparks." Josiah met her gaze, his jaw set. "I didn't start anything, Ruth. I only refused to break someone who's already been broken enough." Her eyes softened, though her expression stayed troubled. "Then be careful. A man with pride can survive the whip. A man with hope?" She shook her head. "The master will kill that faster than anything." That night, as the quarters filled with the sound of restless sleep and muffled coughs, Josiah lay awake, staring at the rafters. He knew Ruth was right. What had begun as an act of mercy now carried consequences he could not control. The whispers had grown into a storm, and storms on plantations never ended quietly. Eleanor, in her room above the hall, also lay awake. For the first time in years, she thought of a future that wasn't defined by shame or her father's cruelty. Yet in the pit of her stomach, fear coiled tight. She had begun to sense the shift in the air, the stares, the lowered voices, the way people seemed to pause when she entered a room. The kindness Josiah had shown her was no longer their secret. It was out there, alive, reshaping the very soil of the plantation. And deep down, Eleanor knew. The more people whispered, the closer danger crept. The master's temper was a legend on the plantation. Men had been whipped half to death for less than a crooked glance, women beaten for spilling water at his table. But nothing in his history of cruelty compared to the rage that boiled inside him the morning he first caught wind of the whispers. It came from an overseer, a man too loyal, too eager to keep his place. He leaned close as the master drank his morning whiskey and muttered what he had heard. "Sir, the girl, and the slave, they say he's gentle with her, that she don't weep as expected. Some say she even looks content. The glass slammed against the table, amber liquid spilling across the wood. For a moment the room went silent. Then the master rose, his face dark as thunder, his hand trembling not from weakness, but from fury he could scarcely contain. Content? His voice cracked like a whip. You dare tell me my daughter looks content in the arms of a slave? The overseer stumbled backward, stammering, I only repeat what's been said, sir. But it spread through the quarters. Even the hands in the fields. Enough, the master roared. His chair toppled behind him as he stormed toward the window. Beyond the glass, he could see the fields stretching wide, the cabins clustered at the edge, and somewhere among them was Josiah, the slave he had chosen for humiliation, now whispered of as if he were something more. The thought curdled his blood. His daughter, the girl he had endured for years despite her shameful body, despite her weakness, now defying him by finding comfort where she had no right. Worse still, the defiance came not in words, but in her very presence, in the way she walked, in the lightness of her step, in the faint glow of dignity that had no place in her life. It was Josiah who had done this. Josiah, who should have been broken by the weight of her flesh, who should have cursed the night he was forced to take her. Instead, he had given her something no one else had dared: kindness. The master's hands curled into fists. Bring him to me, he growled. By midday, Josiah stood in the great hall, the same place where the decision had been announced. His head was high, but inside his heart pounded like a drum. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen, locked away perhaps, or kept from witnessing what was about to unfold. The master paced before him, his boots striking hard against the floor. His voice dripped with venom. Do you think me a fool, boy? Do you think I don't hear what they whisper in the fields? That you put your filthy hands on my daughter with tenderness, as if you were her equal? Josiah said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the strongest shield, but the master read his silence as defiance. He lunged forward, his hand striking across Josiah's face with a force that echoed through the hall. The sting burned, but Josiah did not flinch. That stillness only deepened the master's fury. You dare stand there with pride, he hissed. You dare show your head high when I gave you her to shame you, to remind you of your place. Josiah's jaw tightened. He forced the words out, steady and low. You gave me a human being. I treated her as such. The master froze. For a moment the words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Then with a roar, he struck Josiah again, harder this time, sending him to his knees. You forget yourself, he spat. You forget the blood that runs in your veins. You think her kindness changes who you are? What you are? Josiah lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting the master's. There was no hatred in them, only a quiet, unyielding strength. I know what I am, he said, and I know what you are. The master staggered back as though struck. Rage twisted his features, but beneath it a flicker of fear surfaced. The fear of a man who had ruled through terror his whole life, now confronted by dignity he could not crush. Take him, the master shouted. His voice carried through the halls, summoning the overseers. 2 men rushed in, seizing Josiah by the arms. Lock him in the shed, the master ordered, his voice shaking with fury. Chain him, starve him, beat him if you must, but break him. Break him until the whispers die, and the fields remember who owns them. As Josiah was dragged away, Eleanor watched from the shadows of the staircase. She had heard every word, seen every strike. Her body trembled, but not with fear, with a rising storm inside her chest. For the first time she saw her father not only as cruel, but as afraid. Afraid of Josiah, afraid of her, afraid of what they might become together. Tears blurred her vision, but she did not hide them. In that moment, something shifted within her. Her father's rage had tried to crush the only kindness she had ever known, but instead, it had carved resolve into her soul. She would not let Josiah be broken. Not this time. The shed reeked of sweat, rust, and damp earth. Chains rattled faintly with every breath Josiah drew, his wrists rubbed raw from the iron cuffs that bound him to the post. Days had blurred together. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, thirst cracked his lips, but his spirit remained unbroken. Every lash, every insult from the overseers had been meant to crush him, yet he endured. But what kept him alive was not defiance alone. It was the memory of Eleanor's eyes, the way they had looked at him in that quiet room when he had offered her kindness instead of cruelty. It was the memory of her hand brushing his when she took the cup of water. It was the strange, impossible truth that somewhere in that house, a woman who should have despised him was thinking of him still, and he was right. Eleanor had not slept since the night of her father's outburst. She had heard the chains drag Josiah away, had listened to the slam of the shed door, and since then, her heart had burned with a mix of fury and desperation. She knew her father's rage would not stop at humiliation. It would destroy Josiah completely, and yet even as fear consumed her, something else rose stronger. A determination she had never felt before. For years, she had been the prisoner of her own body, her father's shame and society's scorn. But in Josiah's eyes, she had seen something no one else had ever given her. Worth. That single gift had changed everything. She could not, would not, let him be erased from her life. On the third night of his imprisonment, she stole from her chambers under the cover of darkness. A lantern in her hand, she crept through the corridors, her heart pounding against her ribs. Every creak of the floorboards seemed like thunder in her ears, but she pressed on, driven by something stronger than fear. When she reached the shed, the guards had fallen asleep at their post, slumped against the wall with empty bottles at their feet. She slipped past them, her hands trembling as she lifted the latch. The door groaned open, and the lantern light spilled into the darkness. Josiah squinted against the glow, his body weak, but his gaze still sharp. When he saw her, his eyes widened, disbelief softening into something deeper. Eleanor. His voice was hoarse, cracked from thirst, but the sound of her name on his lips sent a shiver through her. She set the lantern down, kneeling beside him. Her hands shook as she reached for the chains. "I had to see you," she whispered. "I had to know you were alive." Josiah's lips curved faintly, even in his pain. Alive enough. Tears blurred her vision as she touched his face, tracing the bruise along his jaw. He flinched at the tenderness, not from pain, but from the shock of it. No one had touched him like that in years, not with care, not with gentleness. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. "If he finds you, I don't care." She cut him off, her voice fierce despite the tremor in it. "He can lock me away, he can beat me, but he cannot take this from me." "He cannot take you." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two souls chained by different prisons, yet bound together by something neither had chosen. Eleanor's breath trembled as she leaned closer, her forehead resting against his. "Josiah," she whispered, "they call me worthless. They've always called me a burden, a shame. But with you, I don't feel that way. You see me, truly see me." His chest tightened, his heart pounding so hard he feared she might hear it. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his bound hands as far as the chains would allow, brushing his fingers against hers. The gesture was small, but in that moment it felt like rebellion itself. "And you," he said softly, "you remind me I am more than what they've made of me, more than chains, more than a body to be broken." The air between them grew charged, the weight of their words heavier than any iron. For the first time, Eleanor smiled, a small, fragile smile that glowed in the lantern light. She leaned closer still, her lips brushing his, a whisper of a kiss born not of lust, but of longing, of recognition, of defiance. When she pulled back, her eyes shimmered. "They'll never understand," she said. "But I don't care. Whatever this is, whatever we are, it's mine, ours." Josiah's throat tightened. He wanted to promise her safety, to vow he would protect her from everything, but he knew the world they lived in. Still, he gave her the only truth he could. "They can chain my body," he said, his voice low and steady, "but they'll never chain this. Not what we share." Eleanor pressed her hands over his, clutching them as though she could fuse them together. For the first time in her life, she felt not like a burden, but like someone chosen, someone cherished. The shed walls seemed to hold their secret. But already Eleanor knew the truth. This bond was dangerous, forbidden and inevitable. It would cost them dearly, yet in that moment, beneath the dim glow of the lantern, neither cared. The forbidden bond had been sealed. Spring crept across the plantation, bringing with it the smell of tilled earth and budding flowers. But within the walls of the great house, a different kind of bloom stirred, one that could not be hidden for long. At first, it was subtle. Eleanor's face seemed brighter, her steps steadier, her body carrying a softness that looked less like shame and more like change. The servants whispered of her glow, of her sudden quiet smiles, but none dared say aloud what they suspected. For a time, the secret remained locked between her and Josiah, exchanged in stolen glances and midnight visits when the halls lay silent. But secrets, like seeds, grow, and by the 5th month, Eleanor could no longer conceal the truth swelling beneath her dress. The revelation came suddenly, in the middle of a dinner. The master sat at the head of the long oak table, his glass of whiskey in hand, when Eleanor reached for a plate, and the fabric of her gown pulled tight against her stomach. His eyes narrowed, his drink pausing mid-air. "What is this?" he muttered. Eleanor froze. The room went silent, servants holding their breath as the master's gaze fixed on her belly. His chair scraped back with a violent screech, and he stormed toward her. With a trembling hand, he pressed against the curve beneath her bodice, his face twisting into horror. "No," he breathed, his voice low and ragged. "Not possible." But the truth stared him in the face. His daughter was with child. The silence shattered. The master roared, his fury shaking the walls. "Whose is it? Tell me whose." His voice thundered as he shook her shoulders, his spit flying, his rage uncontained. Eleanor's lips parted, her heart pounding. She could have lied. She could have named some faceless man a phantom suitor. But as her father's fury burned into her, she thought of Josiah's hands brushing hers in the shed, of the whispered promise that no chains could bind their bond, and she chose truth. "It's his," she said, her voice trembling, but clear. "Josiah's," the room erupted. Servants gasped, dishes clattered to the floor, and the master staggered back as though struck by lightning. His face turned crimson, then deathly pale. For a moment he could not breathe, could not speak. Then the rage exploded. "Blasphemy," he roared. "You dare bring this shame into my house? You dare defile my bloodline with the seed of a slave?" Eleanor rose, her body shaking, but her voice rising stronger than it had ever been. "He gave me dignity when you gave me nothing. He saw me when you wished me invisible. This child is not shame, Father. This child is hope." Her words, defiant and unflinching, were a dagger to his pride. The master lunged, striking her across the face. She fell against the table, the room spinning, but she did not weep. She lifted her head, blood on her lip, and met his gaze with fire. In that instant he saw it, not just defiance, but a strength that had never belonged to him. The bond between his daughter and Josiah was not weakness. It was power. And power, in the hands of those he had sought to crush, terrified him more than anything. "Bring him," the master screamed to the overseers. "Bring me that dog. I'll tear him limb from limb with my own hands." Within the hour, Josiah was dragged into the hall, chains clanking, his body bruised but his eyes unbroken. He saw Eleanor, her face bloodied, her hand protectively over her stomach, and his heart lurched. The master stood before him, trembling with wrath, pistol in hand. "You," he spat. "You think yourself a man? You think you can stain my family with your filth? I'll end this now before it poisons everything I built." He raised the pistol, aiming squarely at Josiah's chest. The room held its breath. But before the trigger could be pulled, Eleanor stepped forward, placing herself between the barrel and Josiah. Gasps rippled through the hall. Her father's hand shook violently, the weapon still trained on her. "Move," he growled. "No," she said, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. "If you kill him, you kill me. And your grandchild with me." The words struck like a hammer. The master's hand faltered, rage warring with disbelief. His empire, his pride, his legacy, now dangled by the thread of his daughter's defiance. To strike her down would mean the end of his bloodline. To spare her meant living with the unbearable truth that his house, his name, would forever carry the mark of a slave's child. For the first time in his life, the master was powerless, the room filled with the heavy silence of revelation. Josiah's eyes locked with Eleanor's, and though their fate remained uncertain, one truth had been laid bare for all to see. Their bond could no longer be hidden. It was written in flesh, in blood, in the new life growing inside her. The shocking revelation had shattered the master's world, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the revelation were drenched in silence and fear. The plantation, once a place of rigid order and unchallenged authority, now felt like a battlefield waiting for the first cannon to fire. Whispers rippled through the fields, through the kitchens, through the quarters, each carrying the same question. What would become of Eleanor and Josiah now that their secret was laid bare? The master, consumed by rage and humiliation, locked himself away in his study for 3 days. He drank heavily, his booming curses echoing down the halls, his fists pounding on the desk until the wood splintered. Servants dared not enter. Overseers walked with wary eyes, uncertain whether their master would unleash his wrath upon them too. The great plantation, once a symbol of wealth and fear, now trembled under the weight of one man's broken pride. Eleanor stayed in her chamber, guarded by 2 overseers, her every step shadowed. Yet though she was confined, she was not defeated. She touched her stomach often, whispering to the life within her, reminding herself that she was not alone. Josiah was thrown into the holding shed, his chains tighter than ever, yet his spirit did not bend. Each night in the silence, he whispered prayers, not for his own freedom but for hers, and for the child who might carry forward a future unimagined. On the 4th day, the master summoned them both. The gathering took place in the grand hall, overseers lining the walls, slaves forced to kneel at the edges like witnesses to a cruel spectacle. Eleanor stood tall despite her swollen lip, her hand never leaving her belly. Josiah was dragged forward, his chains rattling, yet his back remained straight, his eyes fierce. The master's voice cracked through the silence like a whip. "You have brought shame upon this house. You have defiled my name, and for that there can be no forgiveness." He paced the room, pistol in hand, his breath ragged. "But to kill you both." His voice faltered as his eyes fell on Eleanor. "To kill my own blood, my only heir." He trembled, his rage colliding with something darker, something he had never known before. Fear. Eleanor's voice broke the silence. "You cannot erase what has already been done, Father. This child will live. Whether you accept it or not, the truth will outlast you." Her words struck him harder than any blow. For the first time in his life, the master was confronted with the one thing he could not control: legacy. He ordered Josiah to be whipped, hoping pain would crush the man's spirit, but Josiah endured with silent strength. Each lash a scar carved into the memory of those who watched. Eleanor screamed, begging for mercy, but Josiah's gaze never left hers. His silence became defiance. His blood, spilled across the ground, became a testimony. That night, the plantation stirred with unrest. The slaves whispered of rebellion, of freedom, of a new world where the chains no longer bound them. For the first time, they believed their suffering might mean something. That Josiah's love for Eleanor and her courage to stand by him had cracked open the impossible. Weeks turned into months. The master weakened, consumed by drink and paranoia. His empire began to crumble. Overseers left. Fields went untended. Whispers of the Civil War reached even the farthest corners of the land, and with it, the promise that slavery's days were numbered. Eleanor's belly swelled, and despite the fear that shadowed her, she grew stronger. In Josiah's eyes, she saw not the shame her father had branded her with, but the dignity of a woman who had chosen love in a world built on cruelty. When the child was born, a boy with eyes dark as midnight and skin kissed by both worlds, the plantation changed forever. Some saw him as an abomination. Others saw him as a symbol of everything that could not be undone. The master refused to look at the child, turning his face away, drowning himself deeper in drink. He died not long after, alone in his study, the pistol still on his desk but never fired. His legacy of power and cruelty ended with him, but Eleanor and Josiah's legacy endured. In the quarters, mothers told their children the story of the mistress who chose love over shame, and the slave who gave her dignity instead of hatred. The boy grew up knowing both chains and freedom, both cruelty and compassion. His very existence defied the world that had tried to erase him. Some say he fled north with his parents when the war broke, carving out a new life where no man could own another. Others whispered he stayed, leading those left behind into rebellion. His father's strength and mother's fire burning in his veins. No matter which story was told, the legacy remained the same. Love had bloomed in the unlikeliest of places, and its roots had cracked the foundation of an empire built on blood. Generations later, when the plantation lay in ruins, travelers would pause among the crumbling stones. They would hear the whispers of the past in the rustling fields, and some swore, if the wind was right, they could hear a woman's voice singing softly, and a man's deep hum answering, a harmony that no chains could silence. The master's name faded from memory, buried beneath the dust of history. But Eleanor and Josiah's story endured, carried not in books or monuments, but in bloodlines, in whispered tales, in the quiet knowledge that dignity once given can never be taken away. Their love became legend, their child became proof, and the legacy they left behind was this, that even in the darkest soil, something beautiful could grow.